Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman. I am co-founder and CEO of Acario. Acario provides simulation for voice, chat, and headless agents to make sure that they don't break on your consumers. You figured out beforehand. Today, I have joining me Malo, co-founder of Heal.dev and one of the early product managers for SourceGraph's Cody, which means reliability at scale, and we'll talk about that later. Malo's been up to amazing things in the world of QA and Heal.dev. So Malo, maybe you can tell us more about what you're up to.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me. Yeah, at Heal.dev, we build an AI QA engineer. So what this means is we build a system that's able to automate your testing. So when you're building software, you want to make sure that things don't break. And the more you use AI for development, the more you want to use AI for QA as well, because you don't want to be stuck in this thing where you're testing more than coding, right? And so that's why we're building Heal.dev. And we have this unique approach where we build an agent, but we also support it with QA experts that we have in-house so that our customers get all the value of AI and not just a little bit of value from a tool.
That's amazing. Just to get this out in the open right from the beginning, we actually are really near each other in what we do, and yet we're completely different. And so it's interesting. We have many of the same topics and issues and concerns, but where Acario is worried about specifically agent behavior and agent interaction from turn to turn, you're looking at things like the front end and the website and the code that's been written. So it's actually interesting because we both have these test concerns, we both have these quality concerns, and we're both trying to make developers more effective, but in very different areas. But I'm gonna lean on that a little bit because there are some observations that we've made, and really the big one is with the enterprise. And I'd love to start there because I think you and I are both seeing these sort of trust gap in the enterprise. Have you been bumping into that directly?
Yeah, quite a bit. So we've talked to lots of enterprises, and I think they saw like the potential of AI, like everybody did, but then they saw a bunch of issues in deployment, right? In deploying POCs and converting those into production systems. And there's been a lot of studies about that from the MIT and others that showed that between 5% or something like that of POCs never go to production, right? So I guess some of it is probably due to the fact that too many POCs were started, right? So some problem there might be like focus on what's strategic. But I also think that there's many underlying problems that are interesting and that as product builders, we need to think about, we need to crack. And those are sometimes in the sales process, sometimes in the way the product is built, sometimes in the packaging. But it's a whole like a field that needs to be cracked. And maybe I'll mention a bunch of things I've noted, which is I think at this stage, nobody doubts that AI has this broad overall impact on productivity.
Yep.
Search is a great use case. ChatGPT, like search, code gen, summarization, those are great use cases. How do you measure the ROI of that in an organization? That's tricky, right? And so, but everybody feels that this is happening. Everybody can point to 1 to 3 examples of like very generic use cases being cracked. But what about the more narrow use cases? And this is where like I think there's a trust gap, an adoption gap, an ROI measurement gap. One narrow use case where there's been a great ROI is obviously code gen. Like no developer, I think at this stage, or very few developers doubt that when used right, having a product like Copilot or Cursor or Cody or AMP, I think that's the new name, is very beneficial. But in other industries, we're seeing a few narrow use cases being automated little by little. But still, there's this problem of inflated expectations and delivery lagging behind. And
Well, sorry to interrupt, but I'd love to dive into that a little bit because there's this tendency, particularly for those of us who come from a product background, to hyper focus on outcomes. And at this moment in time, as we're trying to learn all about agents and models, experimentation itself is the outcome. And so I wonder how many of those POCs, it's less about whether they targeted a good part of the business, but rather that the POC's purpose was education and to give them some amount of understanding for how the pieces fit together so as to motivate the next the next selection. Okay, now that we start to understand how this goes together, now where do we apply it? And I think this then goes to exactly the point you're making here, which is, okay, what about these other use cases? What about these smaller pockets of opportunity? Do you think we're getting from learning to focusing in on some of those other pockets?
Yeah. So first of all, like about this learning thing, I wish it was more the case that organizations were allowed to explore more. Because I was a few weeks ago at this conference about dev productivity led by a big investor in the field with older companies. And the decision makers were quite annoyed to be always pushed about ROI because they were
Mm.
experimenting. But the corporate structure around them was asking ROI, ROI, ROI. Like how can we measure the dollar save or the revenue you're making? Right? And to a leader that's distressing when all they're doing is there's new opportunities. I need to learn, I need to experiment, I need to understand what's going on, and my teams need to build that muscle. And so I don't think that we're quite there yet where larger organizations have the capability to take something, experiment, conclude and ship it to production. I feel like there's disalignments in big organizations around that ROI question, what can be expected of AI?
Yeah, and I think both of us would agree outcome orientation is critically important, but it's a time and a place, right? When you get a new technology, a new set of capabilities, you're not even sure how they fit together at the very beginning. But it also, I'm curious whether you think the enterprise is the right place to do that experimentation. I mean, I'm going to put in quotes, traditional mental model is that the experimentation happens with folks like us in startups. Then we go try out all sorts of different things, and then you start to see what works and what doesn't. But in this moment, a lot of what we're trying to collectively build requires data, and the data is in the enterprise. So, I mean, how do you think about squaring those two in what you're seeing?
Yeah. Um, in what we're seeing, the critical piece is just prioritization. And that sounds very stupid, but actually, like, we talked earlier in the precast about constraints. I think a lot
Mm,
about constraints. When you're building products, you have opportunities and business value and what customers want. And you also have constraints. What are the rules of the game? And oftentimes we don't map out the constraints. And so in those big organizations, in general, it's quite easy to understand what's the most impactful for the business. Like there's operations, there's, big customer support teams, big blah, 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 things that we want to automate. And then there's AI. And I feel like sometimes there's a misunderstanding about constraints. What can AI do? That, how do you match those capabilities with the problems that you have? And so, for example, in customer support, sounds like a great use case because you have a lot of data. You have a very clear process that you could describe in a step-by-step, very granular way. And that sounds like a great use case for AI, right? And so I feel like the muscle that big organizations need to acquire is how do I understand what problem is a great problem for AI? Yeah, I've thought a lot about that part. And I feel like we talked earlier about this, right? Like summarization, text gen, code gen, search mapped to problems where you can describe very precisely the process that needs to be followed. And that's why, things like legal products have sometimes a hard time to take off just because defining success is very tricky. Each lawyer
yeah.
has their own way of doing things, whereas customer
Hmm.
support is very standardized. You do this, then this, then this, then this. And so there's the structure to implement AI products. And that's where I think enterprises have a real opportunity. They have areas of their business where there's a process that people follow, and we humans are very bad at that, but agents are getting better and better at that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you've had a chance to lead product in a very innovative area in a fairly large organization, not a Fortune 1000, but a fairly large organization at SourceGraph with Cody Amp. So, what are some like the grounded constraints that you found that you had to put in place to be able to innovate using the Copilot and creating the Copilot?
Yeah, I was on one of the products, right? Just to be clear.
One of many. Yes.
But well, it's funny because so SourceGraph at the time had this very enterprise focus. Like we want to ship to large enterprises, and now I feel like they're going more consumer, just because
Hmm.
they've been they've observed, that's my take. I don't have any inside information, that they've seen that like things like coding assistants need really a PLG workflow. But at the time, we're very much focused on enterprise use cases. And there you start a lot with constraints, right? Like I need zero retention from Anthropic. I need security. I need blah blah blah. I need to prove ROI to decision makers. And so it's maybe a bit contrarian to what you were expecting here, but I feel like we over focused on the constraints there, because this is really a field where you need to be PLG, like start with developers. And so I'm sorry, I'm not answering the question, but
No, but it's good. I mean, what you're identifying, I think, is exactly, frankly, it's very resonant with my own experience, which is it's not a one size fits all. It's not a cookie cutter. And I think, particularly when you start working with a new technology that's not highly understood, but can be amazing at what it can produce, e.g., the models and Gen AI and whatnot, knowing where to place the constraints is really difficult. And so, where I was actually going, I was curious about what your experience there, and I was also going to ask, and so I just will, about heal.dev and how you've thought about constraints as you're trying to build this solution for QA.
right. And this is an area where I think constraints are first and foremost, because when you're testing, you cannot just be producing noise. You need to be creating like results that are very valuable. And so you need to have harnesses in place so that the results you yield to the end user are correct. A. B, you are interacting with software systems which aren't perfect, and it's not a sandbox usually, right? So you need to make sure that you're not destroying anything. So
Mm.
that, and C, you need a lot of auditability. You need to be able to say, this is what I did in order to find the bug, and you can reproduce it this way. Because if you find things that aren't reproducible, that's a big problem in QA, right? Like you're not creating value. And so we started with that. We started with the observation that AI was creating lots of opportunities to automate interacting with browsers, so web agents. And so we created essentially a harness for the agent to be operating and interacting with websites, and make it so this thing is essentially reproducible, it's auditable, it finds real value, valuable bugs. And so we're not a noise machine that you plug into your software system.
So actually, there's some subtle moments in there. How do you think about your agent at heal.dev? Is it a tool for the developer? Is it like, how do you actually project that when you're talking about it?
Yeah, we think about it as an AI agent supported by humans that are experts in their field. The reason we do that is, in general, we find that larger companies don't want a tool; they want to get rid of QA. And
Mm.
actually, everybody in software wants to get rid of this problem. Nobody's really interested in, I'm going to be 10% more efficient in testing. They want to not be testing. They want the results.
They
And
want to
so,
build.
right, they want to focus on building and playing with the new shiny AI thingy that just shipped. And so that's why we created this system where we have an agent with that harness, so with things to make sure that the quality of its results are great and auditable and reproducible. And this thing is supervised by humans. So in practice, what does this mean, right? Because it sounds probably a bit vague. It means that there's someone that gets alerts when things look weird and goes and reviews the results and creates new data and input into the agent so that the agent can get better. So say we find a bug that's not clearly a bug. We have an automated system to understand, is this a problem with the testing system or is this a bug? And in some cases, we don't know. And that's because the agent is not mature enough. Most agents, right? And we don't want to be feeding this back to users. So we have a small review process. And I think this is quite general in the agent world. Like you need to have evaluation systems. Some of them are going to be like LLMs as a judge, whatever. Some of them are going to be human review. But in some business models, you want this to be done by the user. So say like code completions for Cody or AMP, which is an amazing product. You want this to be done by the user. You're going to accept or not the code completion. It's not an agent, it's a copilot, right? But for QA, you don't want this because the
Yeah.
user doesn't care. Like they don't want to be labeling your data. So you need to do this internally, and that's what we do.
So the reviews are done by heal.dev as
Right,
opposed to by the user.
right.
So you're almost an outsourced QA team that's powered by agents.
That's one way to view it, right? You can view it this way, but I don't like phrasing it this way. And the reason for this
Mm.
is outsourced QA team, with all due respect, sounds a little bit like low quality. as in like
Yeah, no,
slow.
that's why I'm asking the question.
Right.
Well, I'm curious about your DTM.
Right. So the reason we don't like this positioning or like this specific choice of words is I think this is not relevant anymore
Hmm.
because the way we view this is you want the problem solved, we solve it. We have a bit of supervision just to maximize the value, but it doesn't make it like an old-fashioned outsourced QA team. And the reason for this is old-fashioned QA teams are slow. They
Yep.
work in like big development cycles, like waterfall specifications to blah, blah, blah. And you have to do a lot of specking and talking to people to get it right. Whereas for us, it's really an AI system that when something goes wrong, there's an escalation somewhere that, rings a bell and someone from our QA team takes a look and makes it so the system behaves better in the future. I see this more as like we have data labeling that's very fast and that's directly in production. Or we have a team of customer success actually, because we're talking about enterprise. Most enterprise software in reality has a lot of customer success people building configuration, like helping customers use it, sometimes even writing code. I think the most trendy job right now is for deployed AI engineer, right? So to some extent, we don't have operations, we have customer success.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you monetize then? Or how do you project monetizing in the future? Is it outcome based? What's the unit?
That we thought a lot about that. If you're not a pure software play, you cannot just be selling tokens. Because
Right.
you use tokens and something else. And in testing, we have a lot of infrastructure costs. And actually the main cost isn't AI, is like running browsers and at scale and very fast, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way we reason is that what takes time is automating a certain amount of tests. And that takes a load on your team that recurs. And the way we map that out to pricing is we just charge by the amount of tests that you have. So
Hmm.
if you have a small amount of tests, you can have the starter plan. And if you have a very large amount of tests, you'll have a monthly plan that is, a fraction of what you'd pay someone to execute those tests.
So your unit is the test execution itself.
Right.
So who defines how many tests there are and how many executions there should be? Is that something the user can control?
Definitely. Yeah. It's something that it's a little bit like monitoring product or something like, a Sentry or something like that, where you can buy a pack that maps to your needs. Like, I need X amount of runs, I need X amount of tests. And then you can, within those bounds, you can define whatever you want.
I think this is an interesting area because it puts in tension two different concepts. On the one side, you're appropriately, and I've been in a similar space, so I understand that appropriately you're identifying unit cost at the execution of the test itself. But on the other hand, as a development team, I almost want to just have this be an exploratory thing where I just say, go, come back with some number of issues discovered, and here's your boundary condition for how much sort of execution costs I want you to spend. And then I'm going to look at the ratio of execution costs to found issues. And that ratio becomes sort of my North Star of how much more I want to put into the system. In other words, as opposed to having to define each one, and there's a weird motivation for engineers to like, and no engineer will directly say, I don't want to have tests, but there's a weird relationship of the more tests I have, the more likely I am to find something. The fewer tests I have, the more it looks bad, but I won't find as many issues. And I want it to be good, but that relationship is always a problem. And coverage is not really a great way of measuring it, especially when you get to functional and you get to end to end. So I'm curious how, like, are you starting to think forward about, well, we can actually create some new models that might package this a little differently, some other ways to, I'm just curious what you've sort of rejected in the world of pricing. Like, hey, we're not ready for this model yet, but what might be to come?
Yeah. So the two things we considered is the model we have today and some like purely usage based pricing where you have some tokens and then you consume them. We've
Yeah.
also considered and rejected the find bugs thing.
Yeah, that
And the
one's hard
reason for
too.
that, even though I want this to be true, like I would really like, I find this like a very beautiful model where you find bugs and then, people pay you. But in practice, what we've observed is software is very buggy overall. People don't care about the majority of bugs. Like, oh, yeah, I know it's an
That's
edge
right.
case. Like, shut up. We've
Yeah,
had
yeah,
those
priority.
conversations.
I mean, people want you to find a P0, but you don't
Right.
necessarily know what a P0 is in every case. I mean, obviously, if the whole system falls over, okay, that's a P0, easy to discover. But there are business rules that are P0 that from the outside you may not know unless you know some detail about their business. Yeah, I agree. And people rarely want to spend for that. Although HackerOne and others have created, bug bounties and other kind of systems that do sort of like, there are some interesting marketplace concepts that you could use around it. But I've still yet to meet someone
Yeah.
who's done a better solution than I agree with what you're putting forward. Makes the most sense at this moment because it gives you a nice dial that you can control and the ease of use comes way down. Do you think there is a future where there's essentially a digital teammate that you're thinking about more in terms of hiring that's in the team, not an outsource, but rather this is a team member and you rely on them, but you also can interact with them to ask like, because one thing we do with like a really good QA team, even now, they often know the business really well. They can make suggestions about how to fix it. They act as oversight. So there are some side benefits to people who are oriented towards understanding the system and how it should behave. Do you think there might be a future for that?
Yeah, we're building definitely towards that. And so the reason we price by coverage, and really it's a metric for app scope, and we
Yes.
might come up with something better that measures like how big is your app, but that's what we want to charge along. But the reason we do that is decision makers, the buyers actually, they want coverage actually. The devs might not like it. They might be like, oh, I know this works. Find bugs. There's no bugs because I built this. Sometimes, there's those types of attitudes.
Oh, yeah, there's
Sometimes
lots of
people,
them.
right. But decision makers want coverage. They want to be
Yeah.
sure that what they ship works. And so our system is designed to align with decision makers. And, maybe it's stupid. Maybe we should be more thinking along the PLG lines. I don't know, like work in progress.
Well,
But
I mean,
in
I
the
think that is
future,
PLG, right? That's the nature of PLG is you make it work for the user. So the engagement and the developer finds it useful. But PLG doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer is the same user, right? That's that relationship, especially in dev tools, is often separated.
right. But getting back to your question, we're building towards a world where we gain more and more and more knowledge about your application that we test. We gain more and more knowledge we can summarize inside into what the business rules are and what an important bug is and what an important bug is. And for example, just to make this a little bit more precise, if you have a warning sign on a website, some sites will have this as a feature. Like if you're building a log management system, warning is good. But some sites have this as a token for an error message. And so we are getting better and better at that. And I see a world where we're going to learn more and more about what a website should be doing, what an app should be doing, and slowly become able to operate within those boundaries and be way more like a teammate, which is the look and feel we try to build towards. But there's
Yep.
still like, technology pieces missing that, would make users feel like the teammate isn't really the super smart teammate you want. It's maybe like beginner level.
Well, I mean, it's I that direction you're heading in over time feels really valuable. Let's take an example of refactoring. Both the engineer and the product person, when they're getting ready to refactor an area for usability reasons, for code reasons, they need to know what it does. And you can spend time and try to read every last piece of code all over everywhere. But inevitably, with modern systems, there's just a lot and it goes in many directions. So being able to ask your partner who tests it what the use cases are, what the test cases are in that area, means you could do essentially test driven development without having to go backwards in time and write down test cases and try to, because that world was, I mean, it's conceptually wonderful, but it's in practice very difficult to actually maintain and to move forward with. But this idea of a teammate you can ask these kinds of questions of, it feels very natural. It feels like you're headed in that direction. You're already exhibiting some of those capabilities. It feels like you're heading further and further down that road and to make that relationship, to make it work. I'm curious, as we're talking about this and working with these digital teammates and seeing the systems come together, I'm thinking about, the human side of the component and the skills that we need to change so that we can better use these different tools and better build them. What are the human skills you think people need to work on to be more ready for AI?
I've been thinking a lot about this and being maybe a bit of a contrarian. I have an answer that predates AI.
All right.
I think critical thinking is very important. Hard to train, takes a lifetime to have like the right critical thinking at the right time. But there's information overload. And quite
Mm.
recently, I was having conversations with friends about an article. Nobody had checked the source. Nobody had checked the affiliation of that article, and it was something about like a very hot topic, like burning point about some political things. And so, and I was, oops, like I'm old enough to have seen the world transitioning from no internet to internet. So I was trained in, checking sources, even though I didn't really like that at school. But that stuck with me. You need to check the sources. And I've seen this group not doing it. And I'm like, ooh, if I was talking to my children, I would tell them, check check the sources, check affiliations, like develop critical thinking, because we're gonna be overloaded with information and we're going to have to sort through it, and AI will help us, but sometimes also mislead us.
Absolutely. That resonates really strongly with me because I think a lot of the ease of information makes us complacent. And we start to trust. And the more we trust, the more we start to become complacent about what's coming in. So that resonates really strongly with me. I don't know how do you imagine we're going to use critical thinking though when we're talking to these agents? How are we going to find out whether the thing they're telling us is right? Do you think that as builders we need to do more to identify things like sources or to give more transparency?
Honestly, I'm scared about this topic. I don't know what's going to happen. I see a bunch of solutions that could be actioned, like, like what's already been done, like mentioning sources, etc. But at the same time, the sheer quantity of information and overload means that we will be the limitation, not the system. And
Yeah.
that's a very tricky, essentially UX problem to solve. And I have no solution. If you find one, let me know.
Well, I agree with you. And I think maybe on that note, we'll end because there's so many UX problems that we need to go figure out. Malo, Marrec, thank you so much for joining today. I love what you're doing at heal.dev, and I wish you the best of luck in building.
Thank you so much.